Latin America is often explained in fragments. A revolution here, a dictatorship there, a best-selling novel, a headline about migration, crisis, or corruption. But what's missing in most conversations is continuity. The long, complex, deeply human story that connects history, culture, language, and literature into one living narrative. Today's episode is not about listing facts or summarizing timelines. It's about understanding Latin America through 7 essential nonfiction books published or sustained in relevance over the last 25 years. Books that do something far more important than just informing. They teach us how Latin American history has been written, who was allowed to speak, which languages were legitimized, and why literature became one of the region's most powerful historical archives. These books explore colonialism without flattening it, independence without romanticizing it, and modern identity without reducing it to slogans. Together, they explain why Latin America cannot be understood through a single country, a single language, or a single historical lens. This episode is for readers who want depth, for listeners who enjoy long-form intellectual storytelling, for anyone searching for the best nonfiction books on Latin American history, Latin American cultural studies, indigenous history, language politics, and the relationship between literature and memory. Let's begin where all understanding must begin, with the moment history. Power and blood became inseparable. Book 1, Born in Blood and Fire, John Charles Chasteen. What makes this book indispensable is not just its scope, but its honesty. Chasteen doesn't treat Latin America as a passive recipient of European actions. Instead, he frames the region as a space of constant negotiation between empires and resistance, elites and laborers, written law and lived reality. From the Spanish and Portuguese conquests to independence movements and modern nation-states, the book reveals how violence and creativity often emerged side by side. Colonialism did not simply destroy, it reordered societies in ways that still shape class, race, and cultural hierarchies today. This book helps us understand why inequality became structural, why identity became contested, and why modern Latin American politics cannot be separated from colonial history. It's foundational because it provides context without condescension, making it ideal for both first-time readers and seasoned scholars. Book 2, Open Veins of Latin America, Eduardo Galeano. This book is often described as controversial, but controversy is part of its power. Galeano writes history not as a neutral observer, but as a witness. He traces how silver, sugar, rubber, oil, and labor flowed outward from Latin America, enriching global empires while leaving the region economically dependent. But what elevates this work beyond economics is its literary form. It reads like a series of historical testimonies, blending fact with narrative urgency. For many readers across the world, this book became their first encounter with Latin American history told from within, not imposed from outside. It demonstrates why literature often becomes history's most durable vessel in regions where archives were controlled by power. Book 3, Brazil, a biography, Lilia Moritz Schwartz. Brazil cannot be understood through a single narrative, and this book refuses to offer one. Instead, it treats Brazil as a living entity shaped by enslavement, racial hierarchy, cultural invention, and linguistic dominance. Schwartz explores how Portuguese colonial rule, African diaspora cultures, and indigenous displacement created a nation rich in creativity and scarred by inequality. This book is essential because it demonstrates how national identity is constructed, not inherited, and how culture often carries truths that political history avoids. Book 4, Silencing the Past, Mitchell Rolfe Truelot. This is the book that changes how you read all others. Truelot argues that history is shaped as much by silence as by speech. Archives omit, institutions forget. Narratives privilege certain voices while erasing others. His work is especially relevant to Latin America and the Caribbean, where slavery, indigenous genocide, and colonial violence were often minimized or sanitized. After reading this book, it becomes impossible to accept history at face value. You begin asking different questions, not just what happened, but why it was recorded this way. Book 5, The Idea of Latin America, Walter Mignolo. Mignolo's central argument is radical, yet quietly transformative. Latin America is not just a geographic region, it is an intellectual construct shaped by European language, classification, and authority. This book explains how Spanish and Portuguese became tools of epistemic control, marginalizing indigenous languages and ways of knowing. It challenges readers to rethink literature, academia, and even history itself as products of power. For listeners interested in language politics, decolonial theory, and Latin American intellectual history, this book is indispensable. Book 6, A History of Indigenous Latin America. One of the most damaging myths about Latin America is that indigenous cultures belong to the past. This book dismantles that idea completely. It presents indigenous societies as contemporary, evolving and intellectually rich, sustaining languages, oral traditions, ecological knowledge, and cultural memory despite centuries of marginalization. This book reframes history as continuity rather than disappearance, reminding us that Latin America's future is inseparable from its indigenous present. Book 7, The Oxford Handbook of Latin American History. This final book brings everything together. It reflects how modern scholarship approaches Latin America, interdisciplinary, self-critical, and globally connected. History here is inseparable from literature, anthropology, linguistics, and cultural studies. Ending with this book allows the episode to move forward rather than close backward. It reminds listeners that history is not finished, it is actively being rewritten. These 7 books do not offer a single story of Latin America, and that is precisely their strength. Together, they show that Latin American history lives in language, culture, literature, and memory as much as in dates and documents. They teach us how power shaped narratives and how voices survived despite it. If you read even one of these books, your understanding will deepen. If you read all 7, it will fundamentally change how you think about history itself.